listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Open Book, Open Mind. I am, as always, your host, Edgar Chaput. And remember, we don't have to like the book, we just have to open it, read it, and keep an open mind. This week, it's another episode especial, in the sense that we won't be talking about a specific book. I want to talk about my perceptions of who reads, how often they read, maybe to a certain extent what they read, and some statistics that I recently found from what I gather is a fairly reputable resource of information about the status of books, at least as it pertains to Canada. I can't speak, I suppose I could speak for other countries, but since this is where I live, whatever data I'll provide in this episode is predominantly limited to Canada. And one of the reasons why this topic came to mind was essentially because I was, and have been, for a few years, let's say, under the impression that nobody really reads anymore, which is, well, as I probably discovered as I did some research, not quite accurate. I can't quite pinpoint, I guess, the most logical reasons why I operated under that assumption, especially considering that there are multiple bookstores everywhere, even in smaller cities, smaller towns. There tends to be some bookstores. Of course, the bigger the city, the greater the metropolitan area, the higher the number of bookstores are present in those areas, as is the case in the city I live in, which is Montreal. And there does tend to be people browsing those aisles in those bookstores, and yet perhaps because video games are so prevalent and streaming and social media are also so prevalent, neither of which really have a whole lot to do with reading, although you can click on links on social media and the internet to read articles. And there are also resources where you can read free books. I'm referring most notably to those in the public domain, of which there are many, in a multitude of languages for that matter. Nevertheless, maybe it's because I personally know so few people who read, perhaps also because prior to quite recently, I didn't invest the time in trying to discover YouTube channels and podcasts that discuss books, publishing, literary reviews, literary criticism. It's just not something that I personally have a history with, and as I was saying, I really don't know that many people. I know maybe a couple, but really not very many who love reading, truly love reading. And so I kind of spent the last few years just assuming that not that many people read, which is perhaps nonsense because, as I was saying, there are still plenty of bookstores out there, both independents and big, large brick and mortar stores like the Indigos, the Chapters, and all that jazz. Furthermore, as I do like to frequent these establishments, there are about 3 or 4 that come to mind that I set foot in every once in a while. And one in particular, which is probably the biggest chain in Canada, Indigo, something struck me I didn't notice it for a long time, but I just very recently that I noticed it as I was browsing the aisles, looking for something to purchase, was how the clientele, at least the last few times I've been there, the clientele, it's either quite older people than myself or very, very much younger people than myself, and more specifically young women. We're talking people who visually they seem to be either in their late teens or maybe their early 20s, but I honestly wouldn't give them anything older than that. And they seem to be everywhere in this stores, and that kind of got me thinking about, well, who reads today in 2025. As I'm recording this, it's the summer, early summer 2025. And it got me thinking about because I'm neither a woman, nor am I in my late teens or my early 20s, nor am I an elderly person. I'm not the retirement age. I have a few decades to get before then. So, and yet there I was, at least a few times recently, in this bookstore, and the clientele that frequents it didn't look or behave like me at all. And maybe we don't necessarily read the same things, but we were all there to browse books and maybe even buy a book. And I thought that was interesting, and I decided to, it got my synapses working as far as, well, who is reading today? I do, and these young kids do, and these elderly people do. Is anybody else? So I did a little bit of digging. Originally, I landed on a study that was based in the United States, I believe from 2016 or 2017. And it was an interesting read. Not that I read the whole thing from front to back, but I did browse it. It was relatively interesting, but I figured, I live in Canada. How about I try to dig a little bit deeper and try to find some statistics that are closer to home? And that's how I landed on BookNet Canada.ca. Which is not something I was aware of before. I discovered them just last week as I was preparing this episode. I'm on their website right now, so if you must know about BookNet Canada. BookNet Canada is a non-profit organization that develops technology, standards, and education to serve the Canadian book industry. Founded in 2002, to address systemic challenges in the industry, BookNet Canada supports publishing companies, booksellers, wholesalers, distributors, sales agents, industry associations, literary agents, media, and libraries across the country. BookNet Canada services and research help companies promote and sell books, streamline workflows, and analyze and adapt to a rapidly changing market. BookNet Canada sets technology standards and educates organizations about how to apply them, performs market research, and tracks 85% of all English language Canadian print book sales through BNC sales data. So that's just the gist of what BookNet Canada does. Not an institution that I knew existed, but it's good to know that they are around and that they are this nonprofit organization that does either supports through logistics or through data and data research, anything from schools to libraries to agents to companies that need to market books. It's good to know that something like that exists in Canada. It's interesting that they're a nonprofit. There is something altruistic about that, since I believe, the beginning of the printing press. It feels like we keep saying, reading is important. Well, maybe not always. In the early days, the idea of reading was maybe a little bit heretical, but, for a few centuries at this point, we keep hammering this point about how reading is so important. And speaking of data research, BookNet Canada.ca does an annual study. They've been doing it for a few years. In fact, when I did a Google research about reading statistics in Canada, I actually landed on the 2023 study, which was conducted in January of 2024. Then I realized, well, since it's already the summer 2025, presumably they'll have this year's version, which they do. So I found the Canadian Leisure and Reading Study 2024. Like the previous version, this one was conducted in January 2025 to 1,211 Canadians over the age of 18. They surveyed Canadians until they had responses from 1,000 people who had read at least one book in 2024. And as far as the methodology goes, readers refer, and I'm quoting from the website, readers refers to the 1,000 respondents who had read or listened to a book or part of a book at least a few times a year in the past year, that being 2024. buying refers to purchasing books from an online retailer or retailing app for ebooks and audiobooks, a physical bookstore that primarily sells new books, a used bookstore or thrift store, a general retailer, or a subscription service. And it sort of goes on for the survey methodology, but you're not here to hear me read off a website about how they went about their study. I do strongly encourage anyone interested in this topic to go to booknet.ca to acquire the full study. I say acquire, it's free. It's a free PDF you can download. But I went through this study, at least most of it. It's not that long. It's only about 35 pages thereabouts. Trust me, there are certain studies, depending on the topic, of course, and depending on the questions asked, that go far beyond 35 pages. But this one is about 35 pages, and maybe just shy of 40. And there were some interesting highlights. For instance, in 2024, 45% of respondents read between 1 and 5 books in 2024. That's a fairly high statistics. I would not have guessed 45% of respondents. Again, 1,000 people. Canada has 40 million people in it. Now, granted, there's some infants in there, there's some babies in there, there's some people who probably wouldn't count in the study, but we're still talking about 40 million, a population of 40 million, and this is a study that talked to about 1,200 people. So, it's all relative. But still, I would not have guessed. If you had pop quizzed me or asked me to guess what some of these figures would have looked like, I wouldn't have said 45. I probably would have said 25 to 30%. Something else that struck my attention was 29% said they had read or listened to 6 to 11 books in 2024, which incidentally was up from the 2023 number, which at the time was 25%. Furthermore, 19% read or listened to 12 to 49 books, which itself was up from the 2023 number, which stood at that time at 15%. Now, these are fairly encouraging numbers. Now, of course, when you're reading statistics, as I like to say, I'm a big fan of this philosophy because I think it's true, or at least if ever it's inaccurate, it's extremely rare that it's inaccurate. But numbers don't necessarily tell the whole truth, but they don't lie. A 45% is a 45%. A 19% is a 19%. Now, what do I mean by doesn't tell the whole story? Well, consider 45% of respondents read or listened to between 1 and 5 books in 2024. So you could have read one book that's about 200 pages, and that's included in the 45%. I mean, you did read statistically, and that's the key word, statistically, you did read in 2024 one book that was about 200 pages, and who knows, maybe even had pictures in it. Maybe it was a coffee table book where, these, and I love coffee table books. I'm a huge fan of coffee table books, but, anybody who's leafs through a coffee table book, yes, they can be well written, they can be informative, the author can have done their research. It's also pretty cool because they're usually incredibly well presented, the design, the covers, and most notably, the photographs or the drawings, whatever the coffee table book happens to be about. So, that would be included in this 45%. So again, impressive number, to at least an extent, a reassuring number, but there are some nuances. And I would say the same thing about the 19% that said they read or listened to 12 to 49 books. Now, that is, reading 12 books in a year is pretty good, I would say. You're an average of one book a month is impressive. We live busy lives, people work full-time, people have families, people have other obligations. So to find the time to read a book, which does require time, it's longer than watching a show, it's longer than watching a movie, it can be maybe longer than playing a video game. I guess it depends on what sort of game and how you're consuming it, but it is one of the longer leisurely activities one can do. So 12 is impressive, but that's such a wide margin, 12 to 49, and it's 19%. How many of the 19% actually read 49 books last year? It's not really all that clear. Leisure time, there was some statistic about how people spent their leisure time, and 52% said reading, which came in 8th place. Among the things that came first were watching, with TV, YouTube, social media, cooking. Interesting. Cooking was well. I suppose we all have to cook, so I guess it would make sense that would come before reading. But again, this was a question about leisure time. That's interesting. That cooking would come ahead of reading, social media, web. Another thing that caught my attention was a question that pertained to reading as a shared experience. Now, 45% of respondents said that for them, reading was at least in part, maybe not exclusively, but in part a shared experience. In other words, they read it aloud to another person. Now, the first thing that comes to mind when you hear that is probably a parent reading to a child. And 27% said they shared their experience with another person. They talked about the book. They shared pictures about the book. They partook in maybe book clubs, reading challenges. So that's interesting because, we sometimes talk about movie going as a communal experience, video games as a communal experience, whether you're on one of the older consoles in your living room or you're playing online. Sports, easily communal experience. Reading is not necessarily something that's considered communal, and yet 45% of respondents said it was a shared experience. Again, a parent reading to their child to get them maybe to fall asleep or to get them into books is a very particular type of shared experience, but still, it's involving two people or possibly more. Audiobooks statistically were on the rise compared to 2020. It would seem as in 2020, 8% of respondents said they consumed their books in audio form. That actually went up to 15% in the intervening years, at least as per or circa 2024. And something else that I thought was interesting was word of mouth as a big driver to get people talking about books, getting them out of the library, buying them, reading them online for free, PDFs, books in the public domain. When it came to how people get to know of books, word of mouth was the biggest factor at 31%, public library at 26%, a bookstore at 25%, which, the same thing. You buy at a bookstore and you borrow at a public library, but interesting that they both have 26 and 25% respectively. Social media at 21%, and that one was a little bit surprising insofar as, I guess, to go back to what I was saying earlier, in my mind, and clearly my misconception of reality, was that social media just wasn't a platform, it wasn't an avenue by which people can get into books, or at least very few people would get into books. And yet, in this survey, 21% said they relied on social, at least in part, on social media to know about books, and online retailers was at 21%. Now, the BookNet Canada.ca study didn't seem to offer any statistics based on gender comparison, disparity, call it how you will. There were some age demographic groups, although, again, interesting numbers, but some of them are kind of self-explanatory. The age gaps were 18 to 29, 30 to 44, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, and 65 and up. And now, all those age groups, again, these are 2024 statistics, all those age groups read at least 1 to 5, 40% of respondents in those age groups, at least 40% read at least 1 to 5 books in 2024. But again, one book, it's still a book, and statistically you are included if you answer that, but, God knows what kind of a book it was, and reading one book in 365 days, it's maybe not that impressive, but still, statistically, you're part of the group. So every one of those age groups, at least 40%, read 1 to 5. Interestingly enough, the 18 to 29-year-olds had the highest percentage for those who read from 6 to 11 books. The 18 to 29 category was at 37%, which is interesting. I wonder if that had to do with university obligations, because that was part of the statistics, at least for some of the questions. I dug around a little bit for that, and I was wondering about that, and it was confirmed in at least some of the questions that if you were at school and you had to read some books, then your answers to those questions technically should be yes. So that's probably explains why the 18 to 29-year-old group had the highest percentage of those who had read 6 to 11 books per year. And that also made me think of those young people at the Indigo bookstore the last few times I went. I guess once you're so accustomed to reading at school, maybe you want to read something else when you're not in class. Although, again, it was mostly young women, not that many young guys. Maybe a few, but not that many. That percentage drops precipitously. The 30 to 44 age group is 28%. The 45 to 54 age group is 29%. The 55 to 64 is 30%, and the 65 and over is 20%. Again, I feel there are ways to explain that. What are most people doing when they're anywhere between 30 years old and 54 years old? They're spending a lot of their time working. They're not necessarily reading books unless they have a very particular job. So that the percentage drops in the category of 6 to 11 books per year in those age groups, not that surprising. Maybe a little interesting that it's only 20% in the 65 and older group. I would have thought, well, age of retirement, more time to read, but yeah, no, only 20%. It's not very high. 12 to 49 books, again, a bit of a wild category that that's where the 65 and up had the highest percentage at 23%. So 20% 6 to 11 books, 23% 12 to 49 books. So I guess they are reading after all. And everybody else sort of hovered around 20%. And there's a 50 or more. 14% of 65-year-olds and above, 14% claim that they read 50 books or more in 2024. Again, if you're 65 and older, you were born and raised and had a childhood, a teenagehood, and your adulthood, or a good chunk, let's say, a good chunk of your adulthood before the age of the internet and social media and TikTok and Instagram Reels. So maybe those people are more programmed to read. That's a lot of books, 50 or more. Woo! So those are just some statistics that I thought were quite interesting. I felt some of them required a little bit of nuance, a little bit of explaining. That 45% looks real good, and then you realize, oh yeah, you can read one book and you're in the 45%. That certain percentages drop among people who are anywhere between 30 years old and 54 years old. Yeah, but people tend to be working and raising families when they're that old. So some of these require a little bit of real world nuance, which is why I keep saying, not just in this episode, but in my daily life, numbers don't lie. They don't necessarily tell the full story. Sometimes you do have to think a little bit outside the box or do some extra digging to understand these numbers. All that being said, I must confess to having a false perception of the truth, what was, as it turns out, the truth, which is there are more people than I thought who read, and there are more younger people than I thought who read, which is an encouraging thought. I'm a big proponent of reading. I'm reading something now, something that should make for an interesting episode. It might be the next recording. It's not something I've read before, and I'm sort of pushing my way through it, not because I don't like it, but anyways, we'll get there when we get there. But reading is a great thing. I've made my peace with audiobooks, but still it is a way of consuming those stories or those documentaries, if it's history or politics or a philosophy book. But yes, please pick up a book, read, and keep an open mind. Open book, open mind. That's the name of the show, and there's a reason why I call the show Open Book, Open Mind. Expand your horizons and enjoy a great book, or at least what I hope is a great book, whichever one you pick up. So that was another episode of Open Book, Open Mind. I've been your host, Edgar Chaput. I hope you enjoyed it, and we will catch you again on the next episode. Cheers.